This is the web transmission service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. Our speaker at Military History Night on October the 7th was longtime RCMI member Jim Lutz. Jim graduated from Columbia University in the dire year of 1968 and immediately volunteered for the U.S. Army. He did his tour in Vietnam as a recon team leader for the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, one of the first air-mobile combat units. Jim shares his reminiscences with us tonight.
So, without further ado, over to you, Jim.
Thank you very much, Pat. I imagine when some of you heard that I volunteered for the Army in the middle of the Vietnam War, you would want to question my intelligence, my sense of self-survival. There were many reasons why I volunteered, and I won't go into them, but a key one that drove it is that under the draft, there were deferments for students in universities, and it covered both undergraduate and graduate. But just when I graduated from Columbia, they did away with the graduate deferment. So if I had come to Canada, I could have been drafted, in which case I would have wound up a private in the Army. And I didn't want that. So I volunteered, and when you volunteer, you get to choose what you want to do. And I said, well, I want to be an officer. So they sent me to infantry officer school, Fort Benning, Georgia, the home of the infantry, the home of the airborne. And it's a 6-month program that produced the kinds of lieutenants needed to drive the large army. Unfortunately, I very quickly realized that all OCS was doing was producing a bunch of automatons who obeyed orders. They were not teaching leadership, they were not teaching the kinds of tactical skills, the two things that leaders require if they're going to run an army. As Pat mentioned, for many years I was a training officer for cadets. At the risk of bragging, I assure you that many of my cadets were better at leadership and field skills than many of the people coming out of infantry OCS in those days. However, one thing I did get out of going to OCS, we spent a lot of time polishing our boots. We spent a lot of time every day in the barracks cleaning the washrooms and the showers and latrines. And I assure you that there are very few people who are as good as I am at cleaning latrines. That is something I at least got out of the Army. So, having quit OCS, I was sent overseas as a private for the infantry. And I got over there and was assigned to the 101st Airborne Division. Now, I'm sure you all know at least the reputation of the Airborne, their famous insignia, the Screaming Eagle that you're familiar with. These are the people that jumped on D-Day. They're the Band of Brothers. They defended Bastogne. In Vietnam, along with the 1st Cavalry Division, they developed modern air mobility. And in the First Gulf War, they fired the first shots and then launched the largest air assault in history. And today, they're the only fully air assault division in the world. So it was a tremendous honor for me to join. I realized then, wow, I'm going to be part of the 101st Airborne. However, as we then got sent off to different units within the division, I was put aside in a room by myself. And then in walked a lieutenant, and he explained that he was in charge of a reconnaissance platoon, which would be like typically 20 or 30 soldiers who would operate in teams of typically 5 or 6. And he said, how would you like to join recon, a strictly volunteer? He said, we do 4 things. First of all, you don't wear green fatigues, you wear the camouflage fatigues. Secondly, you have a special shoulder flash that says recon on it. Thirdly, you don't wear the metal steel pot, you just wear the boonie hat. And fourthly, you don't wear that big heavy flak jacket, because recon's supposed to move lightly. Well, with all of that, how could I resist wanting to join recon? Now, in doing that, though, there were some advantages. It is a small unit, and therefore it avoids major actions. In other words, if the Army is going to attack the enemy, they're not going to send the reconnaissance platoon, they'll be sending the line companies in. So that was a big advantage. Being small, however, also was a risk. because you could very easily be out there, 5 or 6 of you, and suddenly run into an entire company of the North Vietnamese Army in which you have a problem. So you better know how to move around pretty quietly. So I was in recon for quite some time, and I'll get back to that. But then what happened was, as the 101st Airborne had 420 helicopters, and the Hueys that you all know, one of the 2 guys with the machine guns on the side was simply a door gunner, and they needed more door gunners. So they said to the infantry, some of you infantry guys want to come over here and use your combat skills, and you can be door gunners on Hueys. Sounded good to me, so I applied. I got over to the aviation company, a Huey company, and reported to the first sergeant. First Sergeant Ira Dickey was his name. And he looked at my records and he said, college boy, eh? Yes, First Sergeant. You know how to type? Yes, First Sergeant. Well, then you ain't doing no flying, because my company clerk over here is going home next week. You're my new company clerk. So I spent the last few months in Vietnam trying to hold down my smile to my friends, but being the company clerk, and if you remember in MASH radar, and you find out that radar really runs the company, it's true, because it's the company clerk that makes up the list of who's on guard duty tonight and all this kind of stuff. But what I also really enjoyed, this was a company with 20 Hueys that I was working for, and I really enjoyed seeing the inside of aviation, getting to see what the operational mechanical side was like, getting to know all the pilots. Most of them were they were younger than I am, many of them. I was 23. When all that was over, I then finally came up to University of Toronto under A.P. Thornton, British Empire, and the great C.P. Stacey. So that is what I went through. Now, what was it like? Well, first of all, it was heat, heat, and heat. Vietnam or South Vietnam specifically, is in the tropics. It's on the same latitude as Chennai, the former Madras in India. It's on the same latitude as Khartoum in the Sudan, the same latitude as Central America. The temperatures were always, it didn't go up and down seasonally, they were always in the 70s and very, very humid. So it was not a lot of fun, and everyone who ever went to Vietnam in any capacity remembers the moment you got off the plane, whoom, you just felt that compression of heat and humidity just overwhelming you. I can still remember getting off the plane, trying to sleep the first night in a barracks. It was impossible. So first of all, it was in a very hot climate. Secondly, where we operated was near the border between North and South Vietnam in what is known as the A Shau Valley. This is a mountainous area. This is where Hamburger Hill is. And the mountains rise a good mile in some cases, so it's very difficult to get around because these mountains are totally covered by the jungle. And we had triple canopy jungle, in which you really sweated, or we had some open jungle, but that was bamboo. And any of you who ever tried to cut your way through a bamboo patch, you know what it's like. It's very, very difficult. Again, there were tactical pros and cons and movements. I think tankers say if it's good tank country, it's good anti-tank country, and that's the way it was. In the jungle, if you're trying to move, it's easy to move around as a unit because of all the jungle, nobody's going to see you. On the other hand, the very opposite works. If you want to set up an ambush and wait and see if anybody comes by, it's very easy to hide in the jungle. So it could be a pro or it could be a con, depending upon whether you were trying to do patrolling or trying to set up a defense. What else did we have? Mosquitoes, mosquitoes, and mosquitoes, and malaria pills, which are taken every day by the soldiers. Many of the medics were very good about making sure that everybody took their malaria pills every day. Worse than the mosquitoes were leeches, and if you're in the water, then you know what the leeches are like. They were awful. We had one guy that actually woke up in the morning with a leech in his eye. It wasn't very nice. They got it out fine. But the leeches were pretty bad because it was swampy. Swampy means you've got jungle rot. When I came home, it still took me a year or more for my legs, my lower legs, to get over this jungle rot. And the blisters and infections just didn't heal at all. So you got cuts in your hands all the time, and the problem was it just doesn't heal. They stay open. So this is the price you paid of being in the jungle and the swamps. And if that wasn't enough water in the swamp, there's always the monsoon seasons that would come. And that is when you got totally wet. You know, if you sort of get soaked a little bit, you don't like it, but if you've ever jumped into a swimming pool with all your clothing on, you know it's okay once you're totally wet. And that's really what had to happen, because you became totally soaked. It just rained and rained and rained all day, all night, every day, for weeks and weeks on end. So everything you had was soaked, but there was one thing that everyone tried to make sure they kept dry. Anybody in this room want to guess what that thing was?
Cigarettes.
Who said that? Tony. Cigarettes. This was the little plastic container that, you know, designed for American cigarettes that we carried them on. And that was the one thing that everybody had to keep dry. Their cigarettes, very good. But I'll tell you the problem with sleeping in the monsoon. The only way to sleep really, first of all, on recon, we didn't carry tents because they would be too visible and the rain would make too much noise. So we didn't sleep under tents. What we had to do, though, is you found a little bit of a slope with a tree, and you sat on the slope with a tree behind you to lean against. Then you took your poncho, you put it down underneath your rear end so any water rolling down the hill doesn't get you wet. It just keeps rolling underneath the poncho, and then you pull the poncho over the front of you. And that is the way you had to sleep. And if you were really desperate and had to have a cigarette at night, you just had to smoke it inside the poncho. So there was not a lot of fun for sleeping in the monsoons. And then, of course, the night would come. Some years ago, my wife and I were down in the Amazon, and we were out, you know, like an evening walk, see what the jungle's like. And I remember my wife, Lois, turned to me and said she had no idea how dark the jungle could be and how loud the jungle could be. And I thought, yeah, that's right. I forgot about that. At night, you had the problems, too, of the mosquitoes. Now, you had two choices when you sleep. So you lay down on the ground, put your poncho down if it's all wet. And we had what we call poncho liners. I think most of you probably know what they're like. It's a thin material, can give you some warmth, doesn't get very wet. You had two choices. You could lie on the ground and put the poncho liner over your head so the mosquitoes don't get at you, but then you're going to get very hot and it's going to be very stuffy. On the other hand, if you don't cover up your head with the poncho liner, then you're going to get the hell bitten out of you. So that was not a lot of fun at night as well. A lot of funny things happened at night. Couple of stories. I remember one time we had 5 or 6 of our recon teams, and we were set up around an area, and there was probably about maybe 300 meters, 300 yards between each one of us in a certain area. And so we're sitting, it was a nighttime ambush kind of thing. And suddenly in the middle of the night, blam, we hear one of our other teams is having a big firefight. But they're 200 or 300 meters or yards away. There's no way we're going to get up in the middle of the night and try and wander over there and find out what's happening. So all we could do was just roll over, lie down again, cover ourselves up with our poncho liner, and hope that the firefight gets over soon. We had another incident. We were up on the demilitarized zone. Why were we in the demilitarized zone? Because they were in the militarized zone too with their recon, because we have to make sure that the other army isn't going to suddenly run across the border and start a big battle. So there is a landing zone for helicopters that's been cut across the top of a mountain. And the American soldiers were noted for leaving stuff lying around, so it's not surprising. We knew we'll set up an ambush beside this landing zone so that if your North Vietnamese soldiers come around to see if we left any good stuff, uneaten food or whatever, they could get it. So, of course, when you're set up like that, 5 or 6 of us, there's one guy always awake. So in the middle of the night, he shakes me and he says, something out there. And we listened and we could hear slow, quiet, steps, someone obviously looking around the landing zone. And I will tell you that my teeth were chattering so much at this thought. Like, who wants to pull an ambush and have to clear a kill zone in the middle of the night? My teeth were chattering so much that I thought the enemy surely would hear this. So we very quietly opened each of us so we were all awake. And then suddenly, one of the guys on my team farted. And all of a sudden, the soldier, the North Vietnamese soldier on the landing zone, his feet stopped. And then we heard him start again, but moving away from our position. He didn't know what it was that he'd heard, but he didn't want to find out. So he just went back on his way, and we all went back to sleep. So, generally, what did reconnaissance do? It patrolled a lot. It was tactical reconnaissance. It was, let's see if there's anybody up on that hill. There's a river down there where they could get water. Let's find out if they're down there. Let's find out if in this area near this town, if there's any enemy soldiers. So it was really tactical reconnaissance. We did a lot of ambushing along trails. We did a lot of special small unit missions when a fire support base, you know, those typical pictures you always see of the artillery and then the bunkers around it protected by the infantry, kind of our homes away from home. If they were closing a fire base, typically the recon platoon would be the last guys out, so they would be on special missions like that. And we would often cut landing zones across the top of a mountain so the helicopters could come in, fly in, and fly out. Now, we would be there with a bunch of engineers who would be cutting down the trees, cutting the landing zone. And you might say, well, isn't that kind of dangerous? So maybe there's 20 of you and maybe 4 or 5 engineers. It would be fairly easy for a large enemy unit to close in and wipe you out. Well, but stop and think about it. Why wipe out 20 or 30 people? Because you know what's going to happen when they're finished. We're going to get extracted and go back to the fire base, but a whole company or maybe a battalion is going to be brought in. So if you're the enemy, you're going to have a much bigger battle if you want to wait. So in that sense, sounds a little perverted, but in that sense we were a little bit safer. The way we would get into these mountains too was to rappel in. And rappelling today is fairly sophisticated in the Canadian Armed Forces, but this was a really primitive area where we would stand on the skids of Hueys and jump down. And we all had terrible rope burns on our sides and that kind of thing. But it was the beginning of the use of rappelling out of helicopters. We didn't do defense work at all. We were strictly patrolling and more aggressive. Now, although they said we traveled light, I've read that the typical soldier in Vietnam carried about 70 pounds. You couldn't lift it up, your backpack. You had to get down on the ground, put it around your back, roll over, and then stand up. What did you carry? Sea rations were good, of course, and what were called the lurps, which were freeze-dried foods. The only problem with them is you had to have some water put in with them, so you may be limited on your water. We could heat them up by putting a match to C4 explosive. Now you think that's crazy, but the only way you can detonate C4, which is what engineers would use to cut down trees, is you would have to have a detonator to do that, but otherwise you can put a match to it and it just burns very quickly. So we could make a little stove out of a can, and that would be our stove there. We carried, as I remember, it's about 6 quarts of water. We had our bug juice, which was 75% DEET, which is very, very high. Today, what you typically buy in the store is 25, 30% at most. We carried 20 magazines, 360 rounds. That's 18 rounds a magazine. Why? It's a 20-round magazine because the way the magazines were built, the pressure from for underneath the rounds in the magazine, the spring, was a little too much and it could jam the bolt. So instead of carrying the full 20 rounds in a magazine, in a clip, we would just carry 18. to make sure we didn't get screwed up there. Hand grenades, we would carry those. Smoke grenades, of course, to signal helicopters to where to pick us up. CS gas grenades and gas masks. CS gas is something that we could use after an ambush. And then, of course, there was the radio, which same as the Canadians used to carry. The PRC-25 weighs about 25 pounds. And I had to carry one. Usually some new guy had to carry the radio in a unit, which was kind of dumb because you really should have a very experienced person carrying the radio. But I really enjoyed it because you knew what was going on. You'd hear the communication back and forth between your unit leader and the base camp or whatever. So it was really good to carry it. So, you know, when I look back at all of this stuff, in the tropics, in the mountains, in the jungles, in the monsoons, some years after I came to Canada and I got reading more military history, I suddenly thought, and here I was over in Asia fighting a war against an Asian nation, I suddenly thought, God, this is like Bill Slim and the 14th Army. This is Imphal Kohima. This is the Chindits. This is what they had to go through. No wonder that campaign is considered, along with Stalingrad, the worst, most horrible campaign in the war. Now I know exactly what it was like, and I've always had sympathy for them ever since. One of the things that was interesting about the Army, particularly because it was a draft Army, is you really met people that were very, very different from you. A couple of examples. I didn't know anything about country music, but there'd be a couple hours a day when Armed Forces Radio would play country music. And we were sitting in a bunker one time, and I said something about, I like this stuff. And so this guy, Sergeant, was a real Southerner from way up in the hills in Tennessee or somewhere. And he said very nicely, he said, let me tell you about country music. And he explained to me the background, the history, where it comes from, what it's all about. Told me about the Carter family and Porter Wagner and Dolly Parton and all the great figures. And so I gained, as I still have, a great love for country music, but it was because somebody with a different culture explained it to me. As far as different cultures in recon, we had two indigenous soldiers. One of them was a Sioux, I think, in Oglala, and the other was a Comanche. They're from down in Oklahoma, Texas area. These two, I think they were both sergeants, these two were incredibly dedicated soldiers. I don't know if it's true of every indigenous nation, but I know for sure the Comanche and the Sioux both have very strong military traditions. And I don't just mean their own historical, I'm talking about serving in the armed forces of the United States. These two were totally dedicated and also tremendously skilled because they must have been raised in a fairly rural setting because they knew how to get around out there. My best friend in the Army, Gary, was actually not indigenous but raised on a reservation in Oregon because his father had a federal government job there. Gary's notion of weekend fun was to go hunting for mountain lions with a bow and arrow. And he would send us pictures of what he would do. And he was our point man, and I would walk behind him as the slack man. He had incredible skills because he had been raised and would have been schooled and did things on the reservation he was in. And then there was a very interesting thing about the African Americans, and I think most people don't realize this unless they actually were in the Army at that time. In 1948, President Truman integrated the armed forces. And at that point, a lot of African Americans joined the military as a career. So by the time I'm in it, 20 years later, a lot of the senior NCOs in the Army are African Americans. And I will tell you that some of these men that I met in the 101st Airborne, in my basic training, these were some of the most impressive soldiers I have ever seen or met. But interestingly, they were a senior sergeant. I'm a private, and with me are some other African American privates, but they didn't get at all along with that older generation. The older generation didn't give a damn about the issues today, the rock and roll, and I don't know, cultural issues or political issues of the 60s. They were soldiers first, last, and always, totally dedicated to the American military. And for that reason, there was like two separate cultures between them and the young African American privates that were coming into the Army. They didn't have much use for them. There's one other ethnic group I haven't mentioned yet, and that's the Vietnamese. We didn't have much interrelationship with them, but there was in our recon unit, we had a sergeant from the South Vietnamese Army, Sergeant Long. And I got to know him, and Sergeant Long did not speak much English, and I knew no Vietnamese. So, of course, we spoke French, which in those days was what any educated Vietnamese learned to speak. And in getting to know him, I came to realize how truly awful, how truly sad this war was for the people of South Vietnam. And then one day on our fire base, a big Chinook helicopter was coming in, and it crashed as it was trying to land, and Sergeant Long had been on that helicopter and was killed. So about 5 years ago, my wife Lois and I went to Vietnam, not as a returning vet, just as a tourist to see the country. And in the city of Hue, the old imperial capital, we went to a very famous Buddhist monastery. And there I said to our guide, I'd like to go inside to, I don't know, I called it the high altar or whatever you call it. So a Buddhist monk took me inside, and I stood there in front of the ornate high temple, whatever you call it, and said a few words about Sergeant Long, and then thanked the monk and made a contribution to the monastery. And I did that because I just hoped that somewhere up in the Buddhist universe, there's somebody up there that knows that Sergeant Long is remembered from the war. Now, I mentioned about people that I met that were different. Well, there were a lot of people that met me and found me different. I was from a big Eastern university. I'd been to a New England prep school, but I didn't tell anybody that in the Army. I was 23 years old. Most of them were just graduated from high school and got drafted at age 19. Now, in the Army, if there was anything distinctive about you, good or bad, you got a nickname, and it actually was a compliment to have a nickname. So I did have a nickname in the Army. Anybody want to guess what it is? Those sitting here? Anybody? I was called Professor. Hey, Professor. Hey, Professor, when are we going out? Hey, Professor, what about this? So that was my nickname. I still get that. They'll email me, one of my friends from there, and they'll say, hey, Professor, how are you doing these days? So that was my nickname. And in relation to that, my condition there, I received from one of those soldiers one day the finest compliment I have ever had from anyone in life. One of them, one day, I don't remember doing something, and he turned to me and said, you know, for a college kid, you're pretty squared away. That is the best compliment I've ever had. One thing Vietnam War had, nobody will ever have, I don't think. Nobody will ever have the music and the movies that we had there. You just think about the Stones, the Doors, Creedence Clearwater Revival. Got a list here. Fortunate Son, Run Through the Jungle. When I Was Young, Sky Pilot, We Gotta Get Out of This Place. Incredible songs, many of them really kind of themed to the war. Now, sometimes the memory is not the way you think it is, because Armed Forces Radio, I can remember, December 31st, 1969, I'm sitting out in the field, Armed Forces Radio plays music all day. They're going to do the Billboard Top 100 Songs of 1969, not Vietnam, but the United States. They're going to do that. So they're going up there, and here's all these kinds of songs, probably some Simon and Garfunkel in that or something. And they get up to number one. And the number one song that year in the United States was Sugar, Sugar by the Archies. Does anyone remember that little song? Yes, that was the epitome of bubblegum music. That wasn't Creedence Clearwater Revival and Sky Pilot. It was a bubblegum song. But there you go. So that period we think of under the coding of the great songs I mentioned before, but no, in fact, that is not the case. When Ken Burns said he was going to do a Vietnam series, I thought, great, if anybody can do it, he'll do it well. But I was a little worried about it. It's easy to make mistakes. So the first night it opened, black screen, no sound, and then suddenly, out of the dark, the sound of the blades of a Huey. And the moment I heard that, I said, Ken's got it. He's got it right. He's figured that out already. We will thoroughly enjoy it. It was incredible to see aviation as it grew over there. A side story, some years ago, I was down at Fort Campbell, where the 101st Airborne is. General Harry Kennard was down there, and I asked if I could meet him and interview him. He said, fine, come on over. Harry Kennard had been the ops officer for the 101st Airborne on D-Day. He had commanded the 1st Cavalry Division when they first went to Vietnam with helicopters in the famous Battle of Ia Drang, which you see in We Were Soldiers with Mel Gibson. This was the first big battle for air mobility and the ability of aviation to move troops in and out and support the troops while they're engaged in battle. And so I said to him, General Kennard, this was still considered a test bed operation to have helicopters over there. So after the Battle of Ia Drang, how did you, the Pentagon, the Army, come to the conclusion that we should proceed with developing air mobility? And he just said, well, we just said, that seems to work, let's go. I thought, oh my God, can you imagine the bureaucracy of the Canadian Armed Forces or the Pentagon today making a commitment to totally redesign the way the Army is structured? Because a couple of guys said, yeah, that seems to work, pretty good idea. But that's what happened. And so that was like 65, and by 68, there were two whole divisions. In 1968, the 101st Airborne traded their parachutes for Hueys and became the second air mobile division in history. But the helicopters were an incredible thing. They were an icon for those of us that served over there. They carried us into battle. When Apocalypse Now opened, I think that was about 1980, I went the first day here in Toronto to see it. And so at the point there where they turn on Wagner, and the cameras pick up the helicopters, and they're coming in, and all the guys are getting ready, got their rifles ready and everything. That scene was the only time since Vietnam that I've ever felt what I call a shiver of fright, a sudden feeling, oh my God, we're going into battle. I felt that just watching those helicopters as they headed towards the beach for the air assault. Because that's what they did. They carried us into battle. But they also carried us away. And I very much remember we were up inside the DMZ. It was the middle of the monsoon season. It was horrible. We were cold. We were wet. And we knew this was a bad area. We knew there was enemy around here. We didn't particularly like that. So we finally got the word, we're going to pull you out. Go to this grid reference. There was a little hill, bare on the top, so a helicopter could land on it. So we're down off the top of the hill in the bushes. We hear the whop, whop, whop. And one of the Huey arrives. It flares as it goes up. All our Hueys had the Screaming Eagle insignia on the front of it, so we knew it was one of ours. And the helicopter landed on the top. We all got up and ran up to the top of the hill as quick as we could, 5 or 6 of us, threw ourselves into the Huey. The Huey pulled pitch and headed off. And I remember even right then at that time, I looked out and I looked down, and I remember thinking, this is like the hand of God picking you up and taking you out of this place of hell and taking you back to somewhere a little bit safer and a little bit drier. So, political science for 2 minutes. Why did we lose? Well, I think there's 2 reasons. First of all, Americans never seem to understand other cultures. If you did, you would never have taken on the Vietnamese because they've been kicking butt to the Chinese and others for centuries. Very talented people. But the other thing is, there's a famous French journalist named Bernard Fall, and he wrote several books about Vietnam, and then he was actually killed over there. But he was one of the French who were developing the concept of la guerre révolutionnaire, which was a French development out of Algeria and Vietnam, which was what we would call guerrilla warfare. And in one of Bernard Fall's last essays, last journalist articles, he said, if you're losing in a guerrilla war, you're not being outfought, you're being out-administered. And if you understand that, you understand everything there is to know about guerrilla warfare. I think different people have different attitudes about the war. I think it depended upon where you came from and what you were going to go back to. But I just want to read you, my mother kept all my letters. We wrote a lot of letters if you're sitting around on fire bases. There's not much else to do. I'll just read you part of this letter. Already with less than 5 months to go, I've begun to realize that life back in the world, as we called it, isn't a dream, but a reality. Life over here seems like it's always been that way, but now the future is appearing truly within reach, and I know that this other harsher reality over here will end. I already know how much I've appreciated the Army and Vietnam. I've got an awful lot out of the Army and don't regret my experiences one bit. It will be hard acclimating myself to the world, however. I guess others will recognize better how much I've changed. But that phrase, this other harsher reality, is a phrase I have always remembered from my letter, because that is, I think, the best explaining what I saw it as when I was over there and what I look back on after I came home, what I viewed it as. It was certainly a reality, but it's not the reality of living at home. It is another harsher reality. So, in conclusion, what are my feelings? First, I'm very proud of being an infantryman. It was an infantryman's war, very much of that, and that I appreciate very much. Obviously, I was very proud to be part of the 101st Airborne, particularly at the time when it was developing modern air assault warfare. I have a hearing loss, very, very minor, but everybody does who was ever in the Canadian Army and fired weapons, so that's not new. I very much valued the friendships I made. There aren't that many that I keep touch with over all these years. But while we were together, we realized the only way we could make it through was all of us to work together, and that we did as best of friends. And then I think, too, that to serve in an army like that, and this would be true in the Canadian Armed Forces today or any time, is it's rewarding to be part of something that is bigger than yourself. And not even in sports or business can you ever get the same sense that you do in the military because of the pressure on the military to what it has to do to achieve its goals. Finally, last but not least, I have an almost mystical affection for helicopters. And even today, when I hear a chopper overhead, I look up and stare in awe, like some primitive man watching the chariot of his war god journey across the sky. Thank you very much.
There we go.
There, right.
Yeah.
All right, Jim, any questions from the audience? Now is the time.
What movie do you think best captures the infantryman's experience? And what movie do you think is just so totally up to lunch you can't stand to watch it?
I think Casualties of War by Sean Penn is a really awful, tragic film. Not that many people know it. Michael J. Fox was his co-star. The other one that I think was particularly bad was Full Metal Jacket, which just didn't have anything to do with it. The guy, the Marine drill instructor who was in that, the way they cast him and the way he behaved was ridiculous. No drill instructor or sergeant would ever do that kind of thing. Platoon is probably the best all-around picture of everyday life of a soldier. Sorry, which one? Oh, the
one that represented the reality.
Oh, best represented? Well, Platoon, I think, best overall. But the one called Casualties of War with Sean Penn, not well known. And Michael J. Fox is a very sad story about how nasty people can be and ill-treating people. And it's not a typical story, though. Platoon is typical. Sir?
What would your opinion be of Hal Moore and We Were Soldiers Once, or either the movie or his memoirs, or is there any other memoir that you would?
No, he is great. There's no question about it. Wonderful book, and a very good film. I think tactically, the firefights, the way they were mounted, were quite good. So I have only the greatest respect for him. Memoirs, right off the top, I can't quickly name one. I would say We Were Soldiers Once is as good as any. And of course, it shows the birth of aviation. So, any other questions? Sunil?
Sure, sorry, pull this down. Sure. Just a quick clarification. You said you were an OCS, and then you deployed to Vietnam. So were you an officer while you were there?
No, because when you quit OCS, you reverted to a simple private, most of whom will be shipped to the infantry, but could have been shipped elsewhere. So my rank was what Americans call a Spec 4, which is above private, and it's like a corporal, although I was running a recon team, which is supposed to be a sergeant's job, but very often people of lower rank did things of higher because of their experience or whatever. Any other questions?
Just had one,
Sunil, yeah.
one more question. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the decorations you're wearing today.
Oh, well, yeah, I can't remember half of them myself. A lot of them are campaign. The first one's the Bronze Star, which is not for specific action, but for general service. The only one I always say that I care about, the second one, which is blue and orange, is the Air Medal for meritorious achievement while participating in aerial flight. And the Army could give these. They weren't just an Air Force thing. And I have 2 air medals, one for a specific one-day option where we rappelled in, and the other for a series of actions. So I'm very proud of them because it shows that I was part of the birth of helicopter warfare. Catherine.
So, Jim, what did you think of the TV series China Beach?
Oh, boy, that goes back. The only thing I can remember is that I'd spent some time at a beach. 101st Airborne had their own beach, and it was pretty well done. I mean, they tried to make it fun. I think some of the stories about people were fun, but there was China Beach, and other beaches were huge. The country had those beaches. They had a beautiful ocean.
I'm talking about the one about the medics and the nurses, China Beach, the television series.
Oh, wait a minute, the nurses. Yeah, you know,
The reality.
yeah.
And also I was going to ask you what you saw as parallels and differences from MASH when helicopters really went into real usage in the Korean War.
Yeah.
series, which I think MASH was more of a black comedy.
Yeah, I don't remember. I don't remember it well enough, to be honest.
Which was very realistic.
Yeah, I don't
I almost
remember.
went to Vietnam as a nurse, so
I don't remember it well enough.
I read
The nurses and also the Red Cross, they were social workers, whatever, all of them did an incredible job over there. As you know, there's this, after they put up the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, they then went with money I contributed to build another monument to the women who had served in the Vietnam War as well.
if anyone hasn't seen it, I
Yeah.
recommend you see it. It's quite.
Good evening, Jim.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I posted the question on the chat, but I'd be curious, Jim, on your insights. You had mentioned at the beginning of your presentation the challenges when you went through officer training, and you basically shook your head and walked away, and that's why you joined as a rifleman or a private in the 101st. Could you elaborate on why you think that training failed so badly in the 1960s, given the fact that the majority of the people that would have structured and delivered that training were World War II vets? What did they not bring forward from World War II to instill a level of confidence in you to stay in that program? And by the way, great presentation. I enjoyed it.
Oh, thank you very much. I simply looked at the training we were receiving. We worried more about polished boots and standing in ranks than going out in the bush, learning how to lead, how to, do patrolling. They really just didn't teach us any of that stuff. Today, my impression from U.S. performance in the last couple of wars, whether they were politically wise or not, the U.S. Army appeared to do very well. So I think they must have gotten over it. It may have partly been a simple matter that there were so many soldiers being put through OCS that they couldn't cope with it. Our company was 220 students learning to be second lieutenants. So that's not easy to train that many. Does that answer your question?
It does. Thanks, Jim.
Yeah. Any others? Okay, Pat?
Yeah, all right. Thank you, Jim, for,
Actually, before Pat, sorry,
yeah.
before you go and do that, thanks. There is another question in the written chat that you won't see, and it's by Rod Greaves. He indicates that, Jim, in the early days of Vietnam, the M16 was not reliable. Did you experience many malfunctions during your time, and what did the troops do to overcome the weapon issue?
It was not a problem by the time I got there in 1969. The original problem, and I can't even remember, it may have been lubrication or something, but the problem is when they had first been introduced to the Marine Corps first, and the Marines had not been properly trained to maintain the rifle. And I say that as no criticism of the Corps. I'm a huge admirer of the Marine Corps, but they simply had not been trained how to take care of it. By the time I got there, we knew how to take care of it, and it did require some care. The AK-47 was famous for the fact that it could get dirty and crappy and it didn't matter, it still worked. But that was not true of the M16. You did need to keep it clean and lubricated. How's that for an answer?
Perfect. Thanks, Jim.
Okay.
Over to you, Pat.
Okay, thank you, Jim, for a most enlightening and truly outstanding presentation, and for sharing your experiences as a young infantryman in the Vietnam War during one of the most turbulent times of the 20th century. And once again, I reiterate, there is no rival or substitute for first-hand accounts, as we all witnessed this evening. Thank you, Jim, for a most truly outstanding presentation. Now, at this time, I usually present our speaker with a gift of appreciation from RCMI, and although I'm not there in person to do so, RCMI Executive Assistant Susan Cook will do the honors tonight. So, Susan, over to you.
Jim, on behalf of everyone here tonight and everyone who's zooming in, thank you very much for a most interesting presentation and for sharing your experience with us. That was most enlightening.
This has been another in our series of webcasts produced by the Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto as a public educational service. You can find news of upcoming events and links to our webcast archives at www.rcmi.org. On behalf of the RCMI, this is Eric Morse saying goodbye for now, and thank you for joining us.